Hey everyone, I've spent the past few weeks or so retesting the values of every single even remotely viable damage option in Destiny. Today I'd like to present my findings. Unfortunately, the amount of data I have to present could easily fill several hours of footage, even with concise scripting, so I'm going to have to split this into two videos. In this one, I'm going to be going over every single weapon family, while discussing where each of them fits into the meta, or perhaps whether or not they have any place at all. In the next one, I'll cover in-depth ability testing from grenades to supers to melees. Before we get underway with weapons, I'd like to make note of three things. First, some of you have been asking about seasonally flavored damage options. For example, Frenzy Mahis opens up new doors with Expanding Abyss for a Lucky Pants rotation with an energy hand cannon. Shield Crush permits for grenade rotations with better uptime and higher damage. Argent Blade boosts all swords by 15%. Typically, I don't consider artifact mods when I make damage comparisons or guides, but I thought it might be interesting to have some sort of seasonal tab where we compare the most relevant damage options for a given season, somewhere where you can see everything at a glance that's not as complex as the ranking tab rotations or as comprehensive as the sustain tab options. Second, if you haven't watched the video before this one where we discuss boss health and damage changes, the gist when it comes to weapon damage is that we are now at a 15% deficit at -5 with global 25% surges active in raid and dungeons. For abilities, the story is a little different at around 23%, but we'll talk more about that in the next video. Finally, a few of you have been asking me why the buff column has changed to 1.485 this season, up from the 1.35 it had from Lumina last season. The answer is that No Hesitation support frame buff stacks with Lumina multiplicatively, resulting in a 10% buff on top of the 35% you get from Blessing of the Sky. Pretty neat, and a nice effect for a pretty accessible buff. To start things off, I wanted to talk about supplemental DPS options. When you do damage to a boss, you typically have a main damage source, whether it's something like a Whisper, an Edge Transit, or an Apex Predator. Supplemental DPS options are anything you use to pad out your damage in a rotation, which were usually special weapons in the past. There are two categories of DPS supplements I'd like to talk about. Let's start with swap specials, a rather broad category covering any special weapons that are used to fill in the gaps, while a more powerful heavy weapon is doing the, well, heavy lifting. Examples include, but are not limited to, Witherhoard, Mountaintop, Double Slugs, Double Pellets, Breach GLs, Izanagi's Burden, and more recently, Caster Polaris Ergo Sum, Lost Signal, and Still Hunt. Now, swap specials have a lot of subcategories of weapons that are used in different ways. For example, Witherhoard and Lost Signal are an obvious comparison. Alongside weapons like Anarchy and Dragon's Breath, these weapons are used to apply a damage over time effect to a boss while doing main DPS with your other weapons. Speaking of Lost Signal, a lot of people are comparing it to Witherhoard, so I just wanted to provide some data to go with that comparison. One of the more annoying parts of using Witherhoard for damage is that directly sticking a boss lasts a full 10 seconds, which is a long time to fill using your other weapons, rendering the weapon a little inefficient in most rotations that utilize it. While you can alternate between sticking the boss and shooting a pool underneath it to remedy this a little, Lost Signal has a shorter cycle time of 6 seconds while actually doing slightly more DPS than Witherhoard despite being legendary. Pretty cool. Granted, its total damage takes a hit as a result of its pool sticking around for a shorter time, but it still takes over 2 minutes to dump all of its reserves, so you likely won't be running into ammo issues anytime soon with this thing. The other DOT weapon I wanted to talk about is Anarchy. While this weapon does have nearly 6.5 million total damage, its actual DPS is quite low, even considering the fact that you can use special weapons while its traps are ticking. If you want a heavy weapon you can fire and forget about while you shoot your specials, look no further than Dragon's Breath, which is such a versatile performer that it isn't actually classified as a tick weapon in the sustain tab. While the listed DPS value in said tab is incredibly unrealistic, assuming that every shot at an RDM level fire rate is doing full damage, it's still far and away above Anarchy's DPS while not compromising a huge amount on total damage. As for most other swap specials, normally these weapons aren't very good for DPS if you shoot them straight, either because of their low fire rate or their slow manual reloads. However, by swapping on and off of these weapons and using perks like Reconstruction and Autoloading Holster, they become much more effective since the time it takes to reload isn't included in your damage window, allowing you to achieve much higher levels of effective DPS. Recently, I've noticed that swap special viability has been following a trend, a slow death with symptoms emerging over time. This has been due to a number of reasons: the Pack Hunter nerf, Argent Ordnance being gone, stronger heavy GLs, and most of all, this season, the strongest DPS special we've ever got. Even if swapping during DPS to a bait and switch Wildstyle or a Vorpal Nessus Ablation is theoretically very high DPS during that short period, you're then missing out on something like Still Hunt. and Still Hunt deserves its crown. We've had a variety of swap-related metas in Destiny's past, from Izzy Wendigo to slug swapping to rocket swapping to edge transit, but Still Hunt puts them all to shame. For reference, non-surrounded slug swapping executed perfectly at max fire rate does around 180,000 DPS, which is less than Whisper in both total damage and DPS, and Whisper is literally a weapon that you just hold mouse 1 with. And that's not even close to Still Hunt, which achieves a burst DPS value of 1.4 million and a DPS value of nearly 240,000. That's not to say that perks like Bait and Switch are dead. In fact, you can certainly swap with Still Hunt, and players who are not on Hunter should most certainly look to Edge Transit to output competitive DPS. What I am saying though is that even with weapons that are rotation oriented, perks like Envious Assassin make it so that swap specials have become a smaller and smaller slice of the total damage pie when it comes to doing boss DPS. If you're curious for more info, you can check out the swap tab in my spreadsheet, where you can sort by swap DPS and observe as Still Hunt absolutely destroys everything below it, from Mountaintop to Wildstyle to Izanagi's Burden. The second category of damage supplements is primary weapons. There are really two subcategories of primaries when it comes to damage: Lucky Pants hand cannons and exotic primaries that the community has found to be decent for boss damage. When it comes to hand cannons, here's the hierarchy that I found to be accurate: Witherhoard Blighted Malfeasance, Ariana's Vow, Warden's Law, Mai's HC4, the last word with a reload dodge between 2 mags, and regular Malfeasance. You might be surprised to see Ariana's Vow above something like Warden's Law. I was surprised too, which is why I'll be making a Lucky Pants rotation involving it in the future, especially because it has built-in autoloading holster. As for other primaries, a lot of you have asked me in prior seasons to test Outbreak Perfected, Final Warning, and other exotic primaries that are potentially usable for boss DPS. This season, I'm happy to announce that I've tested basically every exotic primary that could potentially be relevant for boss damage. My findings are as follows: Outbreak and Final Warning are better by a mile than anything else, including Hierarchy of Needs, Cerberus +1, Touch of Malice, and of course, Sweet Business with Actium Warrig. For reference, Outbreak and Max Nanites does around 115,000 DPS, and Catalyst Final Warning using a 15-shot burst with Tap Fire and Rain of Fire sits just below that at around 112,000. The next best thing is Touch of Malice at around 94,000, assuming you are able to repeatedly shoot the weapon while your teammates hit the boss with blights. If you're curious about how well Outbreak performs compared to other options around it on the Sustain tab, the answer is quite damning, but not for Outbreak itself. You see, sitting just above Outbreak are two weapons that I think are a good comparison for the exotic pulse rifle. First is Overflow Control Burst Scatter Signal, which is at almost exactly 115,000 DPS. And then right above that is Triple Tap Firing Line Taipan 4FR at 116,739 DPS. That's right, Outbreak Perfected, a weapon with infinite ammo, does almost the same DPS as a heavy linear fusion rifle with a 20% damage perk and perfect rain of fire reload timings. If this doesn't signal that legendary linears need a buff, then I don't know what else I can show you. A word of caution though, Outbreak does approximately 60% of its max nanite DPS if you are starting from 0 nanites, so it's not really great for solo stuff and does take a while to ramp up, even with 6 people shooting. Now that we've spent enough time talking about what fills the gaps between your heavy-hitting weapons and abilities, let's talk about what's actually optimal to serve as your main damage during boss DPS. Sorting from highest to lowest sustained DPS in the Sustain tab, we see that Pack Hunter rockets are still technically the highest sustained DPS in the game, but in my opinion, after the removal of Argent Ordnance, they are generally not worth the investment compared to heavy GLs. Why? Well, in order to use rockets most effectively, you need to use reload assists such as Whisper of Impetus, which is only really good on Revenant, which means you give up using Golden Gun, Rain of Fire and Threat of Ascent, which both prevent you from using something like Starred or Nova Bomb, or Radiant Dance Machines, which is generally very situational, requiring close proximity to the boss, and sacrificing Celestial Nighthawk usage on Still Hunt without a loadout swap. In addition to this, rockets necessitate one player sacrificing their damage by being on Gjallarhorn, whereas Pack Hunter on swords, for example, doesn't really suffer from the same issue. As a result, my general recommendation for more optimal DPS setups is going to involve heavy GLs and Still Hunt where applicable. Obviously, there are Still Hunt rotations that benefit the most from being paired with something like Apex Predator, but I suspect that would be different if Edge Transit was Solar and not Void. Generally speaking, Bait and Switch Edge Transit appears to strike the best balance between total damage, DPS, and ease of use, allowing you to dump all of its reserves in 2 bait procs, as well as only needing to reload at 1 stirring damage if you stack up Envious properly. All of this while maintaining a respectable sustained DPS value of almost 260,000, which is actually higher than straight shooting Still Hunt with Celestial Nighthawk and optimal reloads using Marksman's Dodge and Facet of Command. Speaking of Still Hunt, I'd like to clear up a few things regarding its usage. First, like I said, individually, it's not even close to the highest sustained DPS option in the game. That's because for about 75% of your time using the weapon, unless you are somehow stacking Cade's Retribution by picking up 12 orbs every cycle, the gun acts like a perkless adaptive sniper for the 6 shots that you spend getting it up to speed. Yes, its burst damage is very high, and the fact that you get a full charge from rallying is very useful, but in terms of matching against the highest DPS sustained damage options in the game, that downtime period really hurts the gun. That's not to discount its power too much, it's still an absolute monster, boasting higher total damage numbers than 4 times a charm rapid fire snipers, and higher DPS numbers than pretty much every special in the game besides the 4th Horseman. But if we're comparing to the best of the heavy weapons, it isn't quite as strong, even if it is the swap special to end all swap specials. A lot of my audience has frequently requested that I recommend DPS strategies for the less optimal, more casual environments that they find themselves in. As a result, I've tested a variety of weapons that are generally considered by the community to be easy to use and easy to set up. Starting from the highest DPS, let's move down and take a look. Dragon's Breath hasn't changed much since I last spoke about it on this channel. If you watched my last video, I talked about how I misrepresented its damage per shot by taking an abnormally strong sample, so this season I've retuned its damage correctly to represent more of an average shot compared to what it was before. Today, the Dragon's Breath is an excellent choice for solo total damage, although funnily enough, it does less damage in 12 rockets than Still Hunt does in 28 shots, but that just speaks to the meta we're in today. As for damage rotations, I'll be testing its effectiveness with Song of Flame and Lucky Pants in the future, since that's what I've been seeing a lot of you suggest I try in my last damage rotation ranking video. One more thing, if you're looking at the Dragon's Breath sustained DPS value in the sustain tab, just note that it is incredibly unrealistic because it assumes that even if you are firing shots back to back at Radiant Dance Machine's level speed, every shot is still doing full damage, which is again, like we mentioned earlier, not possible. Legend of Acrius is up next. It comes as no surprise that Acrius is very good, with a strong showing here at about 225,000 DPS. However, something to note is that the Legend of Acrius time to empty value that is in the spreadsheet is incredibly difficult to accomplish because it relies on essentially frame perfect reload cancelling and melee cancelling for your shoot animations on top of precision values and rate of fire. That being said, even if you use Legend of Acrius without Rain of Fire, it should still be a very strong option for melee range bosses, whether you're solo or you have teammates to back you up. Leviathan's Breath is an exotic heavy I've recommended in the past as my default option for a mix of easy DPS and okay total damage. Today that largely remains the same, and I would agree with the idea that Leviathan's Breath is the highest DPS weapon in the game that has the lowest effort required to use it properly and still get good results. It does suffer a little in the total damage department, and it does require some reload buffs to fire at max rate, but it's still pretty decent even if you choose not to buff its reload. Whisper is up next. As expected, Whisper is an excellent performer with an absurd 6.3 million total damage and a respectable 183,000 DPS. This road does assume you are using Foe Tracer, but that 25% buff from 4 surges runs out fairly early and is not refreshed for the rest of the phase, which assumes a 22% buff or 3 surges. With possibly the best balance between total damage and DPS of all of the exotic heavies, the only thing Whisper is held back by is its strict accuracy requirement. 1000 Voices surprised me last season, and this season it surprised me again. If Leviathan's Breath could be used by a toddler, 1000 Voices could be used by a baby. This weapon is right underneath Whisper when it comes to DPS, and yet it's far easier to use, with its only drawback being its lower total damage and its inability to be used by multiple people at maximum effectiveness due to the ignition rate cap. Another popular DPS sniper is Cloudstrike. Now, I used to perceive Cloudstrike as a bit overrated for DPS, especially when people were using it as part of the Cloudstrike Wendigo combo. However, with a lot of people asking me if Still Hunt is still good on Warlock and Titan, I decided to look for a suitable substitute, and in my search I found Cloudstrike. Now, the interesting thing about Cloudstrike is that despite Still Hunt boosting your total damage with its free ammo refund on cast and boosting your DPS with its free golden guns, Cloudstrike actually comes out on top in all 3 departments: total damage, sustained DPS, and burst DPS. Granted, this is with Rain of Fire, but I also simulated reloading Still Hunt with Rain of Fire as well, so I think the comparison is fair. If you're looking for a special weapon to help pad out your total damage in your rotation, and especially if you're using an arc heavy weapon like Wendigo or Crux Termination 4, then I would definitely consider using Cloudstrike over Still Hunt. Microcosm is probably the single most requested weapon that I test for damage, outside of maybe Euphony. In a vacuum, Microcosm looks pretty decent, extremely easy to use, free 20% for 20 seconds by simply casting your super, and it beats Thunderlord with Axiom Warrig when it comes to boss DPS. However, since we're in the ease of use category, we have to look up. And when we look at the context in which this weapon exists, we've already gone over a bunch of weapons that I would consider to be equally easy to use, but with better showings in the total damage and sustained DPS columns. Hell, even Cloudstrike does higher DPS than this thing. Some people might say that Microcosm has basically replaced Thunderlord's role as the heavy weapon that you can use on any boss and still do respectable damage while putting in zero effort. However, I would definitely add Leviathan's Breath to that discussion, and as long as you limit the number of people using it, 1k probably deserves to be here too. That being said, Microcosm does have a higher total damage value than Levy and 1k, so it does deserve a shout out for teams where you might not be one-phasing, or for content in which bosses are a lot tankier, like Master Raids. Next up, I want to talk about Sleeper Simulant, Thunderlord, and Two-Tailed Fox. All three of these are just bad. If you want an easy option, use any of the three weapons that I just mentioned, Microcosm, Levy, or 1k. Sleeper is still plagued by awful total damage. Thunderlord is basically just a worse Microcosm that suffers more from not having a reload exotic, since machine gun based reload is much worse than trace rifle based reload. And finally, Two-Tailed Fox. Now, a lot of people asked me if Two-Tailed Fox was any good with pre-nerf Facet of Command, which allowed you to shoot the gun at max fire rate without ever manually reloading or using something like Marksman's Dodge. A fun fact about Two-Tailed Fox is that it is by far the lowest fire rate rocket in the game. Its fire rate is actually so low that you can manually reload it with Lunafaction boots and be unable to fire it if you have auto fire on because you're still waiting for its fire rate lockout. This means that Facet of Command on Two-Tailed Fox actually didn't do anything. Sure, it was easier to use, but if you just ran loaders and a Lunafaction boost, you could be shooting it at the exact same speed before this patch. And as you're probably aware, it was not very good to begin with, even if you were shooting it at max fire rate, bad total damage, middling DPS, and not much else to its name than that. Next, we're going to talk about damage options that you guys have requested that I test. First up, we have swords. Bungie's indicated that they want us to experiment with swords this season. The artifact includes mods like Blade Stamina and Argent Blade, we've got a new sword archetype in the Wayframe, and Ergo Sum has been the talk of the town with its interesting and unique roles. Speaking of Ergo Sum, one of its possible exotic perks has given legendary swords a shift in the sustain tab ranking. Now that we can apply Pack Hunter to swords, not only has almost every sword on the list gone up by 10 to 15% in DPS, but total damage has also skyrocketed on any roll with Relentless strikes. As you're all probably aware, Pack Hunter projectiles all count as powered sword hits for both Relentless strikes and Whirlwind Blade, and although Bungie recently claimed that they patched this bug, it still works at 100% efficacy as of this patch. So how can we quantify the effect of Pack Hunter on swords? What exactly has it done to total damage? Well, let me give you an example. Triple Tap is a widely sought after perk on linears and snipers. It gives you 1 ammo for every 3 crits that you hit, resulting in approximately 50% more total damage. 4 times a charm is an even more sought after perk, offering you 2 ammo for every 4 crits, resulting in a 100% increase or doubling of your total damage. Where do we think Relentless Strikes leaves a sword? Well, based on my testing, Relentless Strikes gives you 2 ammo for every 3 light attacks with Pack Hunter. This doesn't just double your total damage, it triples it. This means that swords now do the highest total damage in the game by far, outshining even 4 times a charm target lock machine guns, which we'll talk about later in this video. About that example, Surrounded Bequest light attack spam now boasts almost 18 million total damage, which is, for reference, enough to kill Calico 3 times over without running out of heavy. Even a sword without Surrounded, like Whirlwind Blade Gold Tusk, reaches almost the same total value, at just under 17.5 million total damage thanks to its frame's increased ammo capacity. We've talked about total damage, now what about DPS? I'm pleased to announce that Team Summum Bonum is taking first place in the sword DPS ranking. I've tested the Wave Sword archetype a fair amount, and on bosses like Riven, where the uppercut tracking slash stays close to the ground, you were actually able to cycle through your attacks very quickly, approximately every 2.4 seconds. With this timing, Summum Bonum does around 220,000 DPS with a 1 heavy slash 2 light combo. Unfortunately, you cannot use this sword at max rate with this combo even with Swordmaster's Guard, 3 loosened blades, and 5 allies around you for max collective purpose stacks. The fastest I was able to get the combo is in fact that 2.4 second value, but on most bosses you won't be hitting this value anyways, since you'll need to wait until your feet hit the ground in order to start up your 2 light attacks on the next cycle. So on bosses like Herald, your DPS will go down slightly, but it will still be competitive with Surrounded Bequest, and of course Bequest doesn't have access to Whirlwind Blade or Chaos Reshaped. Even perks aside, if we take a look at the reference tab, you'll see that Waveframe swords have inherently higher DPS than Adaptives or even Impact Boosted Bequest, which is an impressive feat on its own. Couple that with the fact that Wave Swords have better tracking to bosses than Adaptives, which tend to not hit full damage as a result of piercing, and you have a recipe for sword success. So we know that Summum Bonum is the strongest sword, but what if we compare it to other heavy DPS options? Well, on its own without Argent Blade, it sits right next to Acrius if you have Enhanced Surrounded, and right above Levy if you choose Chaos Reshaped instead. But with Argent is another story entirely. If we multiply Surrounded Bonum's DPS by 15%, we get nearly 254,000 DPS, which puts it right between Envious Bait at Transit and Still Hunt. Impressive stuff. As for the other legendary swords in the game, if you're curious, you can make a copy of the spreadsheet yourself and filter by swords to compare them. I've included basically every combination that I think is potentially relevant for sword DPS, from Prelapse's Aerial 1 Light 1 Heavy combo to Falling Guillotine with Frenzy and Enhanced Surrounded. A special mention goes out to Cold Steel, which some of you have noted is activated by Pack Hunter projectiles. Unfortunately, much like Chill Clip on rockets, the hype isn't real. With Cold Steel, Pack Hunter, and the usual sword perks on Ill Omen, you get about 139,000 DPS. For reference, a perkless Ill Omen gets around 132,000 DPS. That's a 5.2% increase in damage, and that's assuming none of your teammates are using some sort of slow or freeze effect on the boss that would interfere with your shatter damage. So, pretty bad. But what about exotic swords? There are 3 exotic swords that I think are most relevant for boss damage: Heartshadow, Lament, and Ergo Sum. For the first 2, I unfortunately have a bit of bad news. I retested Heartshadow this season, ensuring that I used a boss that could take all 5 of its projectiles consistently, and I retested Lament in order to check what its Banshee's Whale stacking nerf actually did to its DPS. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, Lament is outdamaged by Heartshadow. What a long way to fall. From being the default sword everyone would pick when it comes to sword DPS on any boss, from Crota to Riven, and look at it now. More specifically, Lament now does about 152,000 DPS with its new optimal combo, 2 light, 1 heavy, 1 regular with 3 loosened blades, which previously did less DPS than the 3L and 4L variants. Heartshadow, even with just heavy attack spam, does almost 156,000 DPS, and this doesn't even take Expanding Abyss into account. Keep in mind that not all bosses are wide enough for Heartshadow's 5 projectiles to track, but this probably comes as a bit of a shocker for those that have been using both swords until now. The Lament is now worse than every meta legendary sword in the game, especially thanks to its inability to receive the Pack Hunter buff as a non-ergo exotic sword. In the same vein, aggressive swords and lightweight aerial attacks do not receive Pack Hunter for whatever reason, which is why they do not have any Pack Hunter entries in the Sustain tab for those curious. Speaking of Ergo Sum, I have a couple things to report. Many of you have noticed that Caster Polaris Ergo has disappeared from the Sustain tab after being placed above Surrounded Bequest in the damage ranking. Shortly after my Ergo video went out, I received information that Transcendence does not fully buff certain parts of certain archetypes combos when doing boss DPS. Now, I did check Caster Polaris with Transcendence against an actual boss and compared it to full uptime Surrounded Bequest on that same boss, and it did come out ahead in that real test. However, given this new information, I wanted to remove it from the Sustain tab in order to avoid possibly spreading misinformation while I attempt to comprehensively test this sword to completion. If you aren't aware, in the coming weeks, I will be testing every single possible relevant damage roll on Ergo Sum, from Caster Perfect 5th with and without Transcendence, Song of Flame for Scorch, and Dawn Chorus to Aggressive Arc Conductor and Lightweight Unplanned Reprieve. What will likely follow is a new video entirely on its own, where I'll discuss all 308 tests that will be conducted by then. In the meantime, given that there are real results to support my findings, I will continue to stand by the fact that Caster Polaris Ergo is at least competitive with the best heavy DPS swords in the game, but as for its exact value, I cannot be 100% certain, hence the removal. Let's keep going down the list of requested weapons. Merciless is up next. Merciless did receive the spec compensation global fusion buff and of course did not lose boss spec in the process. As a result, Merciless remains a good way of dumping your special ammo in a burstier fashion, with higher total damage than the 4th Horseman and higher DPS than something like a typical sniper or fusion. However, Merciless happens to be in the same slot as Still Hunt. You know the drill. That means that if you're on Hunter, Merciless is worse. If you're not on Hunter, Merciless is obviously still fine, given that we previously said that Cloudstrike is better than Still Hunt on Titan or Warlock, and the fact that Impetus boosted Merciless is higher DPS than Cloudstrike, sitting at nearly 198,000 DPS. Parasite is obviously a strong burst option, and many of you probably use it for mini-bosses or the occasional Aatrax. However, I vaguely recall someone asking me to test Parasite DPS, just like raw Parasite. And so this season I actually did. I simulated Parasite with Radiant Dance Machines to see what its DPS is like if you just shoot Parasite and assume that your multi-dodge will be refreshed for all 17 shots thanks to the occasional ad coming by and getting blown up by your worm. I was pleasantly surprised. Parasite spam actually does around 210,000 DPS, which puts it right next to Levy, but it has around 700,000 more total damage at around 4.5 million. Granted, this simulated scenario is obviously a lot harder to come by than just shooting Levy, but it's cool to think about nonetheless. The Prospector is one of the weapons that I decided to test as a result of some Pantheon shenanigans last season. It's actually not bad. Its only problem is actually total damage, at around 3 million, which is worse than Bait and Switch Apex Predator or Edge Transit, which typically have lower total than exotic heavies, but its DPS value is just around 206,000, which is right below Levy, which we just discussed. Much like Parasite, using Prospector to achieve this value does require you to use Rain of Fire, so it's definitely still worse than Levy, but I thought it was worth mentioning. D.A.R.C.I was something people asked me to test as a joke because it got buffed recently. I put it off because I thought it was dumb, but then I actually tested it. And D.A.R.C.I actually does surprisingly decent DPS with a few caveats. In fact, it actually does higher DPS than Whisper, sitting at almost 197,000. However, not only does this value require Rain of Fire, but it also requires you to have 100% target acquired uptime. If you're not aware of how D.A.R.C.I works, whenever you ADS on a target for half a second, you get a perk called Target Acquired. This perk gives you 35% more crit damage and also applies Jolt on hit. The problem is that Target Acquired only lingers for 1 second after you take your crosshair off a target. Rain of Fire with Acrius Dash allows you to reload weapons in approximately 783 milliseconds, so if you're unable to get your crosshair back on the target within the 200 milliseconds or so that you have after Acrius Dashing, you're going to lose DPS by having to reacquire your target. If you don't have Rain of Fire, obviously your damage output will be reduced significantly. On top of this, even with this 35% damage increase, D.A.R.C.I still has a total damage problem with 3.4 million total damage compared to other meta exotic heavies in the 4+ range. Truth recently had its reserves buffed, so a lot of people were asking me to see if it's any good. I'll make this short, it's not. Sub 3 million total, around 165,000 DPS, which is less than Cloudstrike in both departments. Probably the most requested weapon outside of Microcosm, next we have Euphony. Now this new raid exotic linear is interesting. I won't say it's meta-defining or groundbreaking, and it's certainly not Still Hunt with Celestial, but it does fill a niche that wasn't filled before. And that's solid total damage in a ranged form in the kinetic slot. Witherhoard obviously doesn't count, and while 4 times the charm firing line Irukandji does have good total damage, its DPS does leave something to be desired. There's nothing like a Cloudstrike in the kinetic slot, and that's the role that I think Euphony fills best. Now it is a linear, so it doesn't really make sense to swap with it given its punishing charge time, and on top of that it disincentivizes swapping with its stacking spindle perk anyways. The only problem I have with Euphony is that a lot of people are touting it as a Still Hunt substitute, or a heavy weapon substitute, and that it is not. Its DPS value pales in comparison to actual meta heavy weapons and Still Hunt with Celestial itself, and the requirement that it has for optimal DPS is restrictive enough that you'll almost always be using this thing without being at max potential. Now, I've included 2 versions of Euphony in my spreadsheet, much like Outbreak Perfected. One starting at 0 spindle stacks and one at 25. If you want to imagine the DPS if you started with something like a Needlestorm, you can interpolate a value in between. So what are the values? Starting at 0 stacks and ramping up with Threat of Evolution and assuming a Threadling Grenade Threat of Ascent reload between every mag, we get a total damage value of 5 million and a sustained DPS value of 140,000. If we assume that we start damage with full stacks, the numbers change to 5.5 million and 154,000 respectively. For a special weapon, these numbers are certainly not bad. They're certainly better than the competition. Bait and Switch Supremacy has much worse total damage at under half, and 4th Firing Irukandji has lower DPS and slightly lower total damage. However, both of these weapons are legendary weapons, so if you choose to use Euphony, you're going to miss out on a weapon like Cloudstrike, which has higher DPS and comparable total if you don't have Threat of Evolution. So what role does Euphony fill? In my opinion, Euphony is great for padding out damage after you run out of heavy ammo in a total damage sensitive environment. It's not incredibly difficult to use, but it does have some drawbacks that I will say don't really justify it being supported as a very strong DPS weapon. First of all, its actual DPS value is a little lackluster, especially once you consider that I've included Threat of Evolution boosted Threadling Grenades and the Threadlings that come from the weapon itself as part of the DPS value that is in the Sustain tab. If you don't have Evolution on, or if you don't have a Threadling Grenade every mag, which you won't as the cooldown is very long, then your DPS will be even worse than what is present in my spreadsheet. Additionally, if you don't use something like Threat of Ascent, then Euphony's DPS goes down even lower, because it's a weapon that you have to manually reload, unlike Whisper or weapons that have auto-loading holster, or are able to dump their entire reserves without having to reload many times. To me, Euphony is an answer to a question, and that question is, if I'm out of heavy ammo, out of energy special ammo, and I want to make the best use of my remaining kinetic ammo, what weapon should I use? In the past, I would have said something like Irukandji, but Euphony fills this role nicely. The additional Threadlings are great for padding your damage, and its base damage profile even without max spindle stacks is respectable enough. Euphony is good for one more thing though, and that thing is once again demonstrating how bad heavy linears are. Euphony is a special ammo weapon. Scintillation is commonly regarded as the best legendary linear fusion rifle in the game, boasting perks like Envious Assassin, Rewind Rounds, Surrounded, Bait and Switch, and for the quirky, Cornered. The role that most people are going for is Rewind and Bait, which has the most general applicability out of any combination that Scintillation can roll. Do you want to guess how Scintillation performs against a 0-stack Euphony? That's right, Euphony has almost the same DPS, except it has more total damage. The best heavy linear in the game, once again losing to a special weapon. And that's not even considering all of the weapons that are way above the pay grade of both 0-stack Euphony and Scintillation. This is like that video where they compare the size of different celestial bodies and you get to see the scale of an atom against the size of a galaxy. If Euphony and Scintillation are continents on Earth, then just imagine the galaxies that Edge Transit and Still Hunt represent. Bastion was another weapon that was highly requested thanks to its buff and rework. Unfortunately, it did tank the kinetic special 15% nerf, but it did receive a cool trench barrel 1-2 punch hybrid in return. Not only does Bastion effectively have 1-2 punch if you hit most of its pellets, but it also gets a 45% damage boost if you hit a target with any melee damage while you have it out. Now, Bastion is a weapon that I think many people underrated for major and boss damage in the past, and with a 45% buff by its side, it actually does respectable damage. In fact, it actually does similar total damage in DPS to a 0-stack Euphony, at around 4.5 million total and 140,000 DPS. Now, this does assume you are using Rain of Fire, and somehow reactivating Saint's Fury repeatedly, but it's still pretty decent regardless. The Queenbreaker is our final requested weapon that I test. After receiving a recent buff, I am happy to confirm many of your suspicions. It sucks. Lower DPS than Precision Instrument Uzume, a 90 RPM sniper, and lower total damage too. Pro tip though, if you're ever forced at gunpoint to use this weapon, use Marksman Sights, as the DPS change from combat to marksman is extremely minimal, there's literally nothing between them on the spreadsheet, and the total damage difference is almost 1 million. The next section that I wanted to talk about was weapons that I am personally curious about or wanted to test. The first one is Deathbringer. Following the result of some light testing last season, I found that Deathbringer is potentially viable in team DPS settings, even with its visual projectile deletion, and so this season I went out of my way to ensure that my per shot value on Deathbringer was more accurate and realistic, instead of simulating a situation where you hit all projectiles at max height, which is probably not happening on an actual boss. As for team testing, I will be doing more of it instead of just these simulated numbers with Radiant Dance Machines, but that will come in the future when I release my rotation ranking video for this season. Ager's Scepter is another interesting choice for DPS. Isolated, it's actually pretty good. It does more sustained DPS than Euphony at around 160,000, and with the shatter damage buffs this season, I wanted to test it with Facet of Command, Facet of Ruin, and Cenotaph Mask. With these three things and Will Given Form active, this trace rifle is actually capable of outputting over 6 million total damage, which actually bests Euphony's 5 to 5.5 depending on starting conditions. However, that's all well and good, but there's obviously a big asterisk next to Ager's Scepter anytime it's mentioned for DPS, and that is the fact that you need to sacrifice your entire super in order to use this exotic perk. Not only that, but if you want to achieve that golden 6 million number that I just mentioned, then that'll cost you 2 supers, not just 1. And in a sandbox where damage supers like Star Eater Nova and Celestial Golden Gun are doing close to or even over 1 million damage each, that just isn't a compromise that is generally worth considering. And so I can't really recommend Ager's Scepter as a viable DPS option, but if you're curious about the numbers when it comes to Will Given Form, then here they are. Another interesting exotic weapon that I wanted to test was Grand Overture. Now the cool thing about Grand Overture is that you can ready its volley with 20 missiles, and immediately after letting those loose, if you have Actium War Rig, you can continue to fire it in its normal mode. While initially I thought this was a two-tailed fox moment, after further inspection, this is one of the better lazy damage options you can use. While it's certainly no Whisper or 1k or Levy, it does around the same DPS as Sleeper at 159,000, but it has over twice the total damage at 7.8 million. Now this does assume that you rally or pick up ammo after acquiring 20 volley ready stacks, but even if you don't, the total damage is still just under 7 million. For reference, that's better than every other exotic weapon except Tessellation, with every single shot converted into a property irreducible blast. Even Anarchy, with its 2-minute 20-second time to empty for all 28 traps, doesn't reach the same level of total damage, while obviously having much lower DPS. The last two weapons I was curious to test are both a result of the shatter damage buff that came with the Final Shape patch. Salvation's Grip is a little funny. You'd think that making all of the crystals over and over would be higher DPS than shooting it uncharged, but you'd be wrong. The damage of all those crystals shattering, even with Whisper of Fissures, is not enough to offset the amount of time you spend charging up every shot, to the point where the uncharged version of Salvations does about 20% more DPS than charging it. Obviously, the charged version does a respectable 4.55 million total, while the uncharged version sits at much less with 2.7. Suffice to say, while it was an interesting experiment, Salvation's Grip is definitely not viable for DPS, with even the uncharged version being worse than Sleeper at around 156,000 DPS. Finally, we have Critical Anomaly. This one was brought to my attention by my good friend Prelapse, who does a lot of interesting research and experimentation on his channel. While everyone else was busy staring at Two-Tailed Fox pre-Facet of Command nerf, Prelapse had his eyes trained on a different prize, Chill Clip Chaos Reshaped Critical Anomaly. And he was right, this weapon actually does similar DPS to Bait and Switch Supremacy, despite being a worse archetype for DPS. While Chill Clip won't reload your sniper as often anymore thanks to the command internal cooldown, you can still shoot this weapon at max fire rate thanks to Rain of Fire since its RPM is so low. Compared to Supremacy, this weapon is a little worse since you have to reload it above half mag in order to keep Chill Clip, and the final few shots of your reserves won't benefit from Chill Clip on top of your teammates potentially interfering with your shatter damage, but the fact that an aggressive sniper was able to get so close to what was undoubtedly the king of kinetic legendary sniper DPS is pretty impressive on its own. All of this with higher total damage and no ammo regen perk like 4 times a charm too. There are two categories of weapons that you may have noticed I haven't covered explicitly. That's because I was saving them for last. This category is what I'll call bad, and it contains legendary linears and machine guns. We've previously discussed heavy linears in the context of other weapons, but now it's time to address them directly. Linears have always been praised as an easy to use, heavy dump option without the requirement of reload assistance or some sort of rotation. However, as we discussed in the consistent part of this video, there are plenty of easy options out there that are flat out better. Let's take Microcosm, which is the worst option that I recommend for consistent damage. To remind you, Microcosm does around 4.9 million total damage and has a DPS value of just under 165,000. Scintillation is widely seen as the best legendary linear in the game, so why don't we compare it to the bottom of the pack when it comes to my recommendations, 4.4 million total damage and 141,000 DPS. With Microcosm, you don't even need to proc bait and switch, you just need to pop your super before using it, and on top of that, it has a much more forgiving precision requirement, losing only 25% of its damage if you hit a body shot, while linears lose over 70%. Even the best possible scenario for a legendary linear, which I posted on Twitter recently, the double perk Adept Scintillation with enhanced battery swapped to accelerated coils for 25 reserves, envious pre-stacked and swapped to cornered, enhanced surrounded, and Adept mag swapped to Adept charge time plus Rain of Fire. Even with all of these modifiers, this weapon still can't break 175,000 DPS. That's just above Cloudstrike and just below 1k for reference. With that amount of effort and those conditions required to do that damage, you can't really make the argument that linears are easy or convenient anymore, especially when the other weapons in close proximity are clearly much easier to use and often outdamage this role. As for other linears that aren't bursting with insane perk combos and the better of the two linear frames, the situation is a lot more grim, but I'll stop ranting about linears for now since you can check the numbers for yourself in the spreadsheet as per usual. Machine guns are a little more forgivable than linears since they're obviously designed for ad clear and not for boss damage, but since this topic comes up every season, I've decided to dedicate a section of this video just to them. Last season, someone asked me to test Hammerhead with 4 times a charm and target lock to see how good its total damage was compared to Retrofit Escapade. Whoever that was, your suspicions were correct. Hammerhead does in fact do more total damage than Retrofit at 13.65 versus 11.45 million. However, the DPS of all of these machine guns is unsurprisingly rather lacking, with even the rapid-fire representative Retrofit sitting at around 137,000 DPS, and that's with Actium War Rig. For those of you wondering if the new aggressive archetype fares any better, the answer is no. Promomoria with enhanced target lock doesn't best Retrofit in DPS, and even if we get an aggressive frame with 4 times, that situation won't change, only the total damage will. If you want to hold down mouse 1 during DPS, you're better off using Grand Overture or Microcosm. So I've spent a long time talking about pretty much every aspect of the Destiny 2 weapon sandbox, so what do I actually recommend? Well, in this game, there are generally 2 situations you'll find yourself in when it comes to damage. Either you are trying to play optimally and go for fast 1 phases, or you are playing the long game and going for total damage or more consistent damage. While I've already hinted at my preferences for both scenarios, I'll state them explicitly now for the sake of summary. For Raw Burst, we have Still Hunt, which is essentially a Celestial Nighthawk without the super end animation, and it does more damage than a ×20 Parasite. Everything else is largely the same burst-wise as last season, minus abilities, which we'll talk about next video. For more optimal teams that are doing phases longer than an Aatrax, heavy GLs or rockets in conjunction with Still Hunt are probably the play, with swords being a very strong option for melee range bosses like the Herald of Finality, which can be finicky to use the former options on. As for total, more consistent damage, swords are still on the menu. They're amongst the easiest heavy weapons to use for damage, and the Relentless interaction with Pack Hunter makes them the strongest total damage weapons in the game as a whole. 4 times machine guns also have very high total damage, but are generally irrelevant as a result of their insanely long time to empty. When it comes to DPS, for example, in something like a day 1 raid race, you want to balance your total damage, consistency, and DPS to ensure that you kill in one phase without sweating it. I find that LMGs don't really fit this balance very well, as their DPS is maybe a little too low, and also they require Actium Warrig to keep target lock up. Grand Overture is maybe worth a mention since its DPS is significantly higher, but I'd still recommend other more realistic options, specifically Whisper, Still Hunt, Euphony, Acrius, Cloudstrike. All of these weapons have great total damage, relative ease of use, and don't compromise on DPS. One final note about the state of DPS in today's Destiny. While this most recent day 1 raid race has already come and gone, I do see a future in which dumping all 3 of your weapons back to back is a possibility. Before, if you were doing damage optimally, you would shoot all of your weapons in a balanced sort of rotation, but today it might actually be more relevant to dump something like Edge Transit or Whisper, and then swap your exotic to Cloudstrike or Euphony to get through your remaining ammo. What this patch did is create a lot of opportunities for easy to use sustained damage options that largely overshadow the use of rotations in this style of content. In conclusion, Hunters should use Still Hunt like it's a heavy weapon, given that it does almost the same DPS as Envious Bait and Switch Edge, and can have its DPS augmented further using Solar Holster and Apex Predator. Other classes can still use Galleon Rockets or Bait and Switch Edge if desired, otherwise easy general options include Leviathan's Breath, Whisper, and 1k with Ember of Ashes, outside of Swords and Acrius. I'll also recommend Microcosm as an upgrade from Thunderlord and Sleeper, as it carries all of the advantages of both of those weapons with higher DPS and similar or higher total damage. As for my next video, I'll be talking about abilities. I hope you understand why these 2 videos had to remain separate. I didn't want to spend like 3 hours talking about the damage sandbox in one video, so I decided to script it and split it into 2 parts. I've seen a lot of questions about ability damage as a result of the final shape changes, so I'll be touching on all of those topics soon, from a grapple melee on Hunter versus Titan, to super comparisons between Star Eater Nova, Needlestorm, and more, to grenade DPS viability, to Hellion damage measurement. It's all going to be there in the ability part 2 of this video. As for rotations involving Still Hunt and other new options, that will be in the rotation ranking video. Until then, I'll see you next time.